of the double V hull and improved mobility and the power provided by engineering change proposal number 1. But I'm concerned that the current budget request for fiscal year 19 doesn't seem to provide for converting the Army Stryker Brigade combat teams to modern Stryker A1s quick enough. Getting them out in the field seems to be important, particularly with new threats emerging around the world. Could you please give me an update on the Army's plans for production of the Stryker vehicle?
Yes, sir. We are looking at, like you said, improving the survivability by adding the double V hull. We're looking at improving lethality by adding the 30mm gun and some anti-tank weapons. I had the privilege of actually seeing a Stryker when I was in Grafenwehr, Germany in January. Walked around the vehicle, spent some time with the soldiers. They are very impressed with what they're doing. It will go through operational testing now for several months, and I think that we will make an assessment with regard to its performance, and all the feedback now is good. I would note, in terms of procurement, we've increased about over 18% over the FY18. So it's something that General Milley and I are watching closely, but you know, the commitment is to make sure we improve the survivability and lethality of all these vehicles as we look at, you know, this great power competition that we're in now.
And as you're aware, Senator, you know, we are putting money against it, but we're also, it's a balance right now. So for the Bradley, the Abrams, and the Stryker, these systems were designed and came online many, many years ago. Now, they've had various upgrades and improvements over the years, but they are products of technologies and ideas that come out of the 60s and 70s, vice today's world. So the next generation combat vehicle, ground combat vehicle that we're working on, it's in the R&D and S&T phases and the prototyping, et cetera, that will eventually replace the entire family of vehicles that we have. The Abrams, Bradley, and Strykers, realistically, their lifespan is probably 10, maybe 15 years. So we are putting improvements in double VL, lethality, and some other things. But what we really need to do now is to make the shift in money and investments to a next generation combat vehicle, and that's what we're doing with our modernization accounts.
Well, speaking of the next combat vehicle, could you please talk a little bit about, or at least give us an update on the prototyping effort, which is something different that seems to make some sense?
Yeah, the philosophy or the methodology, we've shifted and we're incorporating much more prototyping, which will crunch down the amount of time it takes, because there's a long lead time to the Army acquisition process. It's very linear. It's step by step. It's left, right, or left, right, or left, right, or left, down the line. So what we want to do is accelerate that by bringing in prototypes. And in terms of the next generation combat vehicle, one of the things that we're accentuating in it, it must be optimized for urban operations, which our current families of vehicles are not. It must be optimized so that it can be both manned and either autonomous or semi-autonomous, robotic, depending on what the commander chooses to do at the time in the situation in the battlefield. Those are significant and radical changes to the current system or family of vehicles. So there are companies, there are corporations and industries out there that are already producing robotic vehicles. They're just getting modified, and we are prototyping them. We have several experimental prototypes going on right this minute that are showing some promise. We're not there for down selecting or picking vendors or anything, but we are experimenting with the various technologies, and we think that by 2028, we should be able to begin fielding a next-generation combat vehicle that's optimized for urban operations, that's both either manned or unmanned for ground operations, that has lethality, power, speed, weight, that's optimized for the next generation of a battlefield that we perceive. And we think we'll have that fielded inside of 10 years, which under current Army practices would take 15 or more.
And as mentioned in a previous question, a great deal of this work is being done on the civilian side. Obviously, I'm very involved in self-driving vehicles for Michigan and what's happening in the auto industry. A lot of work is being done in Michigan, Tardac, and other places.
Absolutely.
You mentioned the next generation vehicle with the autonomy features. Do you see having two different variants, or will all of these capabilities
There'll be multiple variants. There'll be a tank-like variant. There'll be an infantry carrier-type variant. There'll be logistics and medical variants. It's a family of vehicles. It's not a single vehicle, but they'll be based off of common chassis and common engines and power packs and so on.
Well, my question related to those variants, will they all have autonomous capabilities? Or
yes.
Will some
every every ground and rotary wing vehicle that the United States Army produces from now on, the next generation, after Bradley, after Abrams, every single one of them has to have the base requirement. It has to be either manned or unmanned, robotic, either fully autonomous or semi-autonomous, built into its very basic requirement. It has to be able to have that option so that the commander on the battlefield of the future has the option, based on mission and enemy and terrain and time and troops available, to pick whether he wants this objective to be seized with manned vehicles or not. And it depends. It depends on the situation, sort of thing, at the moment in time. But we want that option to be available to company commanders, battalion commanders, brigade commanders in the future. So the requirement for all vehicles in the air or on the ground is both manned and unmanned.
And Senator, be clear, we're looking expansively. It is beyond combat vehicles, as the Chief just alluded to. So, for example, within this year, the 101st will be experimenting with an unmanned squad support vehicle. I'm talking to our senior acquisition executive about unmanned trucks so we can transport supplies, and we hope to accelerate that as well so we could be experimenting in the next couple of years with regard to unmanned sustainment, logistics support.
Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here and for your service. General Milley, thank you actually for the 3 years that I've had the opportunity to get to know you. The only thing I don't like about you is you're a Patriots fan, but thank you for your generous time in the office yesterday. Just a quick update. You and I talked, I think it bears repeating. Talk a little bit about what it means to become a more lethal force, and and hopefully a limited amount of time. I got 1 or 2 other questions, but I think running through that's very important.
Well, just briefly, I mean, the way I look at it is you evaluate an organization both based on its individuals but also on its collective capability, and we look at the training, the equipping, the manning, and the leadership. So for training, we want to make sure that a lethal force, collective entity, a squad, platoon, company, etc., has got many, many reps at their basic mission essential tasks. Not 1 or 2 reps, but hundreds of reps, if not thousands of reps. That's what makes the Patriots a great football team, is because they do it thousands of times before they win, except against the Eagles. So but reps matter. Reps matter. So one of the things, the initiatives we're doing is a synthetic training environment, which will give leaders and collective units thousands of reps, relatively cost-free, without going out into the field. So training's important, lots of reps. That applies to the individual as well. In terms of equipping, to make sure that not only do you have the right amount of equipment on hand, but that equipment works, so spare parts and the maintenance of that equipment so it's fully operational. And we want to make sure that that organization has the most modern equipment that is available, really, that money can buy. And then in terms of your manning levels, we don't want units going out to training at home station or at the combat training center at 75 or 80% fill. We want them going out into the field to train at 90, 95, or 100% or even more, to train, because they get the full benefit of the collective training experience. And then the leadership is key. We want leaders who can operate in intense environments, middle of the night, smoke's going on, bombs are going off, people are screaming and bleeding right next to you, and yet you can still make incredibly complex and difficult decisions under intense pressure. They can be morally correct decisions, ethically correct decisions, and tactically correct decisions, and you can do that in unbelievable pressure. That's what it takes in a modern environment, but that's the same type of leaders that it took in World War II at Normandy or Iwo Jima, in the Korean War and Vietnam and so on. So that's what increased lethality. It's the combination of training, equipping, manning, and having excellent leaders that are up to the task. Units that are fit, they're able to shoot, move, communicate, protect themselves, and sustain themselves.
Do y'all think that sequestration is going to be helpful to achieving that increased lethality?
No, it'll kill it.
I want to talk briefly about Futures Command. I believe that Army Futures Command, that Senator Warren may have brought it up. I look forward to seeing you all go through the process and assessing the various states that may be the most hospitable to house that command. I know that you're going to start proceeding through the process over the next week or two. And it's like I've said a number of times before, I will never fight for a dollar in North Carolina that can be better spent somewhere else. I look forward to that selection process being a level playing field, absent political pressure to go one place or another because of the jobs or economic impact. When we're constantly trying to fight to get you all more money, the last thing we can possibly do is satisfy the political pressure of any one person or any one delegation when you know in your heart of hearts there's a better and more optimal place to put it. And the states that are under consideration, the cities that are under consideration, have the onus on presenting the best possible case. And your onus is to make sure that whoever doesn't get it, should it be North Carolina, Massachusetts, any other state you may be considering, that you've got a well-articulated reason for why whatever choice you had based on the numbers, based on the empirical data, was the best place. And I will heartily support that decision, regardless of where it goes. I obviously would like for it to be in North Carolina, but only because it's the best and highest use of the limited dollars that you have.
I can assure you, Senator, that Secretary Esper has laid out a rigorous process. It's totally apolitical. It's totally based on data and analysis, and that we are very rigorously and deliberately going through that and evaluating each location based solely on its own merits with no political interference whatsoever.
Thank you all very much for your service. We may submit a few questions for the record.
Thanks, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary Esper, I understand you'll be visiting White Sands Missile Range next week.
Yes, sir.
So I want to thank you for taking the time to visit that facility. I think you'll be incredibly impressed at just the scale of the range in part, which is very unique. I want to ask if you're able, if you might take a few minutes and quickly visit what used to be the old 2nd Engineering Battalion facilities. It's about $170 million worth of brand new facilities at White Sands that is currently sitting vacant. At the very least, drive through that footprint. I think it'll give you a better understanding of the potential for hosting a security force assistance brigade at that site. So if you would, I'd ask you to fit that into your schedule.
Yes, sir.
Super. I very much appreciate that. As you know, the full New Mexico delegation and local communities support the addition of that mission. And I think one of the things you'll find at White Sands is that it's an incredibly safe community with good quality family housing, and for that matter, one of the best schools in the state. So it's a very attractive place for folks to serve. General Milley, I was really glad to see the Army place a high priority on modernization and the short-range air and missile defense in particular, and was particularly impressed to see that General McIntyre and the Army's new cross-functional team have accelerated some systems by up to 5 years. I think that's good news to all of us here who recognize, as you said, that we've sort of taken a break from modernization for far too long. Do you believe that CFTs will be able to shorten the prototype development and fielding timelines for your modernization objectives, and how are you seeing that come together?
I do. I think it's come together tremendous, and I think that the process that we put in place, the organization that we put in place, and the governance or oversight we put in place is very effective, and I have no doubt that it's going to shorten the procurement and acquisition timelines. You know, the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, General Jim McConville, and the Undersecretary of the Army, Ryan McCarthy, are driving this, and these guys are driving it hard, and they're sitting on top of the 6 cross-functional teams. There's actually 8, but 2 of them are embedded under 2 others, so there's 6 total teams that are working each of those 6 modernization priorities: long-range precision fires, next generation, future vertical lift, and so on. With respect to air missile defense, and McIntyre, he's doing a great job in driving that. You're correct. We, the Army, have been blessed by having the greatest Air Force ever known throughout the history of mankind, in that we, the Army, have not come under enemy fixed-wing air attack since the beaches of Normandy. If we get into a conflict with a great power, those days will be gone. We will likely be under attack from enemy fixed-wing. Our Air Force will, again, do a tremendous job, but we, the Army, must protect ourselves. So air and missile defense is a critical capability to protect our unit formations, and it's a critical vulnerability right now. So we want to speed that up as fast as we can. We're doing that, and McIntyre is leading the way under the supervision of McCarthy and McConville. So the 3 Macs are bringing it home.
Are you comfortable with how much the Army is budgeting towards RDT&E funding to meet those modernization and testing goals?
Well, from my perspective, I would always like more to put in there, but it's a balanced portfolio.
Sure, I get that.
And we think, the Secretary and I think, that We have balanced it for the FY9, for not this proposed budget 19. We think we have about the right amount. We've increased it, I think it's 8% or so, in terms of our R&D and S&T capabilities. So we think it's balanced. It's not optimized, but it's balanced.
I very much appreciate that approach. During the AUSA Global Force Symposium, General McIntyre said that the first prototype platoon of Strykers equipped with directed energy weapon systems will be fielded by 2023, but that he'd like to move that timeline further to the left. What can we do? Is it just a matter of funding, or are there other things that we can do to assist with that? Because I think that's a very important development.
I think, Senator, I'd have to look at whether it's the funding challenge, but there is a technology challenge as well. That's why we're trying to work with the other services on that. And he's talking about fielding. We are trying to push hard to move left as quickly as we can. It does get to the bigger issue about sustained funding beyond 19 to make sure we can make those big procurement bets at that point in time. But
you know, Secretary, if anything, I finally see that we're turning a corner on recognizing just how far the technology has moved. And now it's more a matter of getting all of these technologies through the various processes, working out how they're going to be used in the field. It's not so much a limitation, in my view, on the technology anymore. It's a limitation in how quickly we can work out the details of how they will operate in the field.
Right, and our view is don't make the perfect the enemy of the better. So even if we get limited power at a limited range, we'll start there, and then we'll continue to upgrade as the technologies mature and build upon it.
I look forward to working with you on that, Secretary. Thank you both.
Thank you. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary General, welcome. Thank you for your service. Secretary Esper, the capability gap separating the United States and its competitors, Russia and China, has reached a troubling inflection point. Over the past 2 decades, for a whole lot of reasons, the U.S. military hasn't been able to match the rapid pace of Russian and Chinese military modernization. Both nations are reaching parity in some areas once dominated by the United States, such as field artillery, reactive armor, air defense artillery, electronic warfare, and anti-tank guided munitions. Furthermore, the training and professionalism of the Russian and Chinese militaries have seen steady improvements as well. That's why the recently released National Defense Strategy explicitly directs the U.S. military to prioritize the threats emanating from Russia and China. The NDS will have far-reaching implications for how the U.S. military trains, equips, and postures its forces. Each of the services will play a significant role in the implementation of the NDS, which requires new and innovative ways of conducting joint operations. In light of the NDS, what does the Army see today as its primary mission?
Our primary mission is to deploy, fight, and win the nation's wars, Senator. And as the National Defense Strategy is outlined in this era of great power competition, our focus is on high-intensity, near-peer threats, possibly Russia and China, or namely Russia and China. So that is our core focus. Now, in addition to that, the NDS outlines the need to, of course, protect the homeland, the need to preserve irregular warfare as a core competency, but those two strategic competitors are our primary focus.
How is the Army prioritizing the threats posed by Russia and China, but both in the context of weapons procurement, but also transitioning the mindset of our soldiers from a global war on terror to a more expeditionary posture?
So we have moved to focus on high-intensity conflict in our home station training and our training centers, particularly the National Training Center. When I was there in November visiting and the 1st Cavalry was going through the training, they were actually facing scenarios that the Ukrainians saw in eastern Ukraine against the Russians, high-intensity use of drones, et cetera. So training is one. With regard to materiel, as we've outlined today, there are 6 modernization priorities that we think, if fully exploited, will ensure our overmatch in the out years. So that's the second part of it. And again, we must, as the Chief spoke eloquently on earlier, continue to develop our leaders to make sure that they are prepared for the future battlefield and train the soldiers as well so that they can fight along the entire spectrum of conflict, which may mean that they don't have access to communications, electronics, et cetera.
I'm also concerned about the modernization of our armored brigade combat teams, such as those at Fort Hood and Fort Bliss in Texas. Technology such as active protection systems and reactive armor have failed to keep pace with where Russia is currently. I understand the Army has started fielding systems like Trophy before deploying to Europe. What is the status incorporating APS systems like Trophy on our armored vehicles such as the Bradley or the Stryker?
Senator, you're correct. We are outfitting some armor brigades with anti-protection systems, active protection systems. We're looking at the same with regard to Bradleys and Strykers. But there are other things going on as well. We're upgrading the Abrams tanks. The budget we see in 18 and 19 will allow us to accelerate the upgrade of 5 ABCTs from 10 years to 5 years. And, of course, we're pursuing other ways to improve the survivability and lethality of these systems.
Additionally, how are you working to ensure that our armored formations incorporate technologies such as APS, FLIR, and other off-the-shelf technologies to keep pace with the threats that exist today?
I would say, and I would defer to the Chief here as well, this is one of the areas where the schoolhouses are looking at requirements for the future fight, certainly across functional teams, to make sure that we are incorporating whatever technologies are available to do that. Certainly with regard to communications, we have pivoted now to looking a lot more at commercial off-the-shelf technology that we could ruggedize. I've seen that already with regard to how we are outfitting the Stryker and Infantry Brigade combat teams. And it's the only way we're actually going to be able to keep up with the changing pace of technology in the communication sphere.
General, anything to add on that?
Yeah, in the seconds remaining, I would just tell you that we are actively upgrading our Bradley and Abrams formations. But as I mentioned earlier in a previous question, the Bradley and the Abrams came into service when I was commissioned as a second lieutenant. They have served the nation extraordinarily well, but they are fundamentally at the end of their lifespan. We'll probably get max another 10, maybe 15 years out of these vehicles. We have maxed out their weight, the technological upgrades that we can do. So hence the modernization program of a next-generation combat vehicle. But we are aggressively upgrading Abrams and Bradley and Stryker in all of our formations throughout the Army. And I'm very confident that those weapon systems will continue to serve us well, even against a Russia or China in the near term. Because, armies don't go to war. Nations go to war. And armies don't win wars. Nations win wars. And we go as part of a joint force. So it's not just the Army. It's the Army with the Marines, the Navy, the Air Force, the CIA, and so on and so forth. And it's the synergistic effect of all that combat power in time and space against the opponent, whether it's China, Russia, no matter what the country. That's what brings victory or defeat. We do know that decision in war happens on the ground. We know that because war is part of politics, people live on the ground, and so on. So it's important. The Army's contribution to that piece is critically important, that we have a decisive, conventional capability that can conduct campaigns over extended periods of time to do combined arms maneuver and defeat the armies of the opponent, and then to take control of the landmass from the enemy army. That's the fundamental task of any army, and that's our task as well. We're confident in our current capabilities. We're confident in our current systems relative to Russia, China, or anyone else for that matter. But we are keenly aware of the modernization programs of both Russia and China right now, and we are keenly aware that we need to shift gears rapidly into the modernization in order to make sure that we don't have parity or that they don't close the gap across the gap. We want a military across the board to be unbelievably lethal and unbelievably dominant so that no nation will ever challenge the United States militarily. That's what we want.
Good. Thank you, gentlemen.
Good statement. Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is for both Secretary Esper and General Milley. Senator Cruz has touched upon the National Defense Strategy and how ready we are, but I want to focus on the Asia-Pacific area. And China, of course, is a significant rival in the Pacific, and it's important for the U.S. to project strength, reassure our allies, and build partnerships in Asia-Pacific, particularly in light of the actions of China and North Korea. So I have a series of questions for both of you. How are you resourced for mill-to-mill exercises in the Asia-Pacific region? How are you resourced to cover Army requirements in the region? Is the Army's force laydown appropriate to meet current threats? And does the Army envision directing additional assets to the Asia-Pacific area of operations? Let's start with you, Mr. Secretary.
Senator, I'll take a shot at the first question. One of the most important programs we have out there for improving interoperability and addressing training in the Pacific is the Pacific Pathways Program. The U.S. Army Pacific Commander has requested $61.8 million for that program in FY19, and the Army fully funded it. So I think we will continue to sustain that level of training and readiness as we look ahead. With regard to disposition of forces, there are currently no plans to put more forces in the Pacific that I'm aware of. I'll defer to the Chief if there's something else. But really what we're focusing now is to make sure that the troops prepare both at home station and through our training centers for the high-end conflict, whether it occurs in Europe, Asia, or elsewhere.
Chief?
Yeah, I would echo that, Senator, that we have a very wide variety of exercises in the Pacific that you're very familiar with. Pathways is one of those, and we think we have adequate funding in the 17-18 series of bills, and we're requesting adequate funding in the 19 series of bills. And those are really important that the United States Army remain continually engaged, because China, Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific really is the priority in the national security strategy and in the national defense strategy that Secretary Mattis has laid out for us. We think we have adequate funding and resources to do that, and we have a considerable amount of Army forces not only in your state of Hawaii, but up in Alaska, on the West Coast in Washington, and forward in Guam, Japan, and Korea. So we've got a good array of forces throughout the Pacific region.
Well, there is a concern about the fact that the service deputies testified in the Readiness Subcommittee in February, and they all stated that nearly 70% of young people in the U.S. today are not qualified to join the military. And your fiscal year 2019 request calls for an increase in end strength of 487,500 regular Army soldiers. And will you be able to continue increasing end strength without lowering standards, given the small pool of people who meet the current standards?
The short answer is yes. I believe we've done a lot of modeling and estimates on that, that we can increase our force by 4,000 or so each year that we've been shooting for, and we've been meeting that to date, and I think we'll meet it in the future without lowering any standards. So the key is standards. It's a standards-based Army. We're not going to lower those, and I think we can meet the end strength. As far as 70%, and what the vices all said, 70%, that's a statistic that's been out there for a considerable length of time. That's well known. But we focus on those that do meet the standards, and we're not going to move the standards.
You have nothing to.
I completely concur, and I would say actually in many ways, we all face that same problem. We being the services, in terms of how we attract youth, we are putting more money into recruiting, into other ways in which we can attract youth. The National Guard is doing the same, and so it's a challenge. But we will not lower standards to bring a young man or woman into the service. And in fact, if anything, we are raising standards, and we are looking at, for example, how can we extend either basic training or one-station unit training to make sure that the product we put through is ready to go, that young man or woman, when they arrive at their first unit.
Let me ask a question about cyber capacity, because that is an issue of concern throughout all the services. And last month, General Nakasone testified about the success of the Army Cyber Center of Excellence that you're having in developing and training a cyber workforce, including the first class of enlisted cyber operators who graduated from the Army Cyber School last August. And what percentage of soldiers trained at the Army Cyber School come from the reserve and guard components? And do you envision growth in these numbers in the future? And as the Army continues to successfully train cyber operators, how will that affect the Army cyber efforts across the service? And could the Army model employed at the Cyber Center of Excellence be scaled up to train other services or members throughout the government?
Senator, if I can, let me speak broadly, and then I'll get to one of your questions there. One of the things I was most pleased to find when I came into this role about 4.5 months ago was how far the Army had progressed and what it had achieved with regard to cyber. So we have a cyber school, a cyber command, a cyber MOS, a cyber branch, and are doing really well with regard to bringing people in. The goal is to have 62 cyber mission force teams. We currently have 41 in the regular Army and are building 21 in the Guard and Reserve. I was at the Guard Bureau a couple weeks ago, and they told me that they're up to like 30 teams in the States and building more. So I think there is, we continue to grow. I think the Guard, the States provide good opportunities because there's a lot of talent out there that is familiar with these skills, and they are working in the private sector. So to bring them in as a Guardsman is a great opportunity to capitalize on skills they already have.
Do you want to ask something before?
Yeah, on the percentage, it's roughly a third. We can get you the exact numbers. You were asking about the RC at that are getting trained. And in terms of growth, absolutely. The cyber is a domain of warfare. Land, maritime, and air. The normal three traditional ones, but now space and cyber. So developing capable cyber forces in the joint force in all of the services is critical to our warfighting capability in the future. So this is an area of absolute growth, no question about it. And we're very fortunate, and you know him well, General Nakasone has led the way for the Army and done a great job there. And, of course, he's the nominee who will be taking command of Cybercom here shortly.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Perdue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both for your service. General, I just returned from North Korea, and I just want to make a comment to you. I've been around high-performance teams all my life, and I have to tell you, General Brooks and your team over there is absolutely the best of the best. And I want to thank you for the training and the preparation of those young men and women over there. I was really proud to be surrounded by them. So please pass that message along, both of you.
Will do, Senator.
You got about 24,000 soldiers over there. I think this the National Commission on the Future of the Army recommended that the Army consider forward deploying a combat aviation brigade to Korea in order to bolster the aviation readiness on the peninsula. This spring, an Army, as you mentioned, I believe earlier, an Army tank brigade, the 1st Brigade, 3rd Division, I think, from Fort Stewart, deployed to South Korea to deter potential aggression over there and to make sure people around the world know we're serious. Can you give us an update on the forward deployment strategy with regard to Korea as you best can in an open conversation like this?
Yeah, as you know, we've got 28,500 U.S. military personnel. Of those, 25,000 or so are U.S. Army. And we rotate an armored brigade combat team, as you noted, through there on a regular basis. They go over there for a deployment. It's a heel-to-toe rotation. That's a critical capability that's necessary in order to deter North Korean aggression. In addition to that, we've got the headquarters of the 2nd Division. We've got artillery capabilities. We've got ballistic missile defense with Patriot and THAAD. Forward deployed, we've got appropriate sustainment and intelligence capabilities and a variety of other capabilities built within that 24,000 soldiers. And as you know, the situation on the Korean Peninsula is dynamic right now. We've got a very important strategic level summit meeting between the President and Kim Jong-un coming up here shortly. Right now, the U.S. strategy is to maintain maximum pressure and to continue our capability to deter. And we'll see what develops in the diplomatic realm. The main effort is clearly to resolve our issues with North Korea through peaceful diplomatic means, but to retain the capability and for the options to be presented to the President if diplomacy does not work. So that's what we're doing. We're maintaining our maximum pressure, we're maintaining our readiness, and we're keeping those forces under General Brooks at a very, very high state of readiness.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Mr. Secretary, you both have spoken to the 5 domains and the growing domains of space and cyber in addition to maritime, land, and air. We've been getting these cyber briefings in the subcommittee on cyber, and I have to say it's very sobering. In an open environment like this, though, there are some concerns that we can discuss relative to the integration. I know we have one approach for the government, but when we look at the services, and this is your responsibility, talk to us about the integrated efforts between the services so that we don't, so that we have best practices, we share best practices, and we also have a concerted effort that can efficiently compete with the absolute rapid development in both China and Russia.
Yes, sir. This is an area of focus as well for all the concerns you outlined. There is certainly a lot of cooperation going on between the services and with OSD, I might add, to make sure that we are protected from the tactical through the strategic level. Certainly for the Army, we're building a lot of capability to brigade level and above to deal with the tactical problems that we might face. I can tell you with regard to the modernization priorities and the cross-functional teams, I've talked to them, and they're committed to making sure that whatever we procure for the future is cyber hardened and cyber resilient. As you think higher and look across the DoD, we're looking at the same thing to make sure we can protect our data. It's recognized that this is a vulnerability. I can't go into too much detail, but there's clear recognition that that's the case, and we need to be able to attract the talent, as the Chief spoke to, the talent from the private sector to make sure that we are on the cutting edge and are capable of defending ourselves in what is considered, it could be considered an asymmetric vulnerability.
Thank you both. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Dr. Esper and General Milley, thank you for being here and thank you for your service. On April 3rd, 2018, the American Medical Association wrote a letter to Secretary Mattis decrying the recent policy released by the White House. Echoing concerns raised by the American Psychological Association and two former Surgeon Generals, the American Medical Association said, quote, "We believe there is no medically valid reason, including the diagnosis of gender dysphoria, to exclude transgender individuals from military service. The memo mischaracterizes and rejected the wide body of peer-reviewed research on the effectiveness of transgender medical care. Yet the DoD, quote, panel of experts, quote, came to a drastically different conclusion from the preeminent medical organizations in America about gender dysphoria, the effectiveness and impact of gender transition on medical and psychological health, and the ability of transgender service members to meet standards of accession and retention." Who represented the Army on this panel?
For the Army, it was, I believe, the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, General McConnell.
And did the Army include any health professionals on the panel, and if so, who?
I know there's been a lot of, I don't know the specific answer to your question in terms of on the panel, but there were, General McConnell consulted with lots of internal folks, medical professionals, absolutely, yes.
Can you submit to the committee who was consulted specifically?
Absolutely, yeah, sure.
Do you know whether any health professionals from within the government and outside of it testified before or consulted with the panel in written testimony, or was it just verbal?
With the DoD panel? Mm-hmm. I don't know if it was written or verbal, but I can get you the answer.
Whatever was submitted, we'd like to see, please.
Yeah, sure.
Thank
you.
Sure. And are you aware of anyone else who contributed to the panel?
Each of the service vices, I believe, was on it. There were several DoD folks. I'm pretty sure the panel was led by DoD PNR, if I remember right, Personnel and Readiness, the Undersecretary for Personnel and Readiness. We can get you the exact names.
Great. Thank
Sure.
you so much.
Yeah.
And any information they submitted.
Sure.
Dr. Esper and General Milley, in light of the existing injunctions, DoD is currently operating under the previous transgender open service policy put in place by the last administration, yet transgender soldiers have now seen the department's recommendations and are on notice that if the policy is implemented, they will get kicked out for seeking care or treatment for their gender dysphoria. I'm worried that this uncertainty will have a negative impact on these individuals, but also on their units, and that fear of these recommendations will stop these soldiers from seeking care. What are you doing to ensure readiness in light of the pall that has been cast on the future of transgender soldiers?
Senator, we continue to treat every soldier, transgender or not, with dignity and respect, ensure that they're well-trained and well-equipped for whatever future fights. With regard to accessions,